Facebook.com/RJ Bistro.
You are watching the multi-awarded Radio Bandido TV on channel 224 Sky Cable and TV Plus boxes. Simulcast on DZRJ 8:10 a.m. Informing, advising, and entertaining the Filipinos and OFWs around the world. Streaming live on www.facebook.com/DZRJ 8:10 a.m. or on YouTube, channel DZRJ 8:10 a.m. Radio Bandido.
The views and comments of the hosts and guests are not necessarily those of the station.
Good morning, Philippines. This is the World News Jam right here on DZRJ and Radio Bandito TV. My name, as always, is Eric Lecain, coming to you from Makati, the Philippines. We're about to talk about stories going on around the world. What's the biggest news right now outside the Philippines, so you can stay very well informed. Now, this week, we are going to, of course, take a look at what is happening in the U.S. with all the massive changes that the Trump administration is attempting to do. Everything from putting a freeze on programs for regular Americans to gutting the FBI, to the Senate hearings of his controversial picks for his senior cabinet, also heading back to Russia to check on the war, figure out what happened to all those missing Ukrainian people. Also, what the heck is DeepSeek, the new AI software that is crashing the U.S. tech stock markets? So let's get started. But before we do, sometimes the news we have to do is very sad. This week is one of those days. On Wednesday night in Washington, D.C., a plane was coming from Wichita, Kansas. Near the same time, a U.S. Army helicopter was flying in from a base in Virginia. The passenger plane had 60 people on board, including a woman who just received her master's degree and was heading to her new job. Also, a civil rights lawyer about to start a new teaching position. Even a person from the Philippine National Police who was traveling to the U.S. to test personnel vests. Also, an engineering student, both his parents going to visit them at the college. Also, 14 teenage athletes and coaches coming back from an ice skating camp, some of which had dreams of going to the Olympics one day. That was just a few on the flight, just about to land into Ronald Reagan Airport. But also, that particular night, a UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter was also in the air, and for some reason was flying much higher than they were supposed to. In fact, it seemed they were 100 feet more above the permitted altitude. In listening to the air traffic control conversation, the controller told the helicopter that a commercial airline was in the same area and that they were to be on the lookout in case it was very close. The helicopter pilot said he was aware of the plane, so everything seemed fine. But the question was he looking at the right plane? Witnesses that were watching the plane flying through the air said that all of a sudden it turned hard to the right and sparks were flying from the bottom of the plane, then a white flare in the sky like a strike of lightning. What they were seeing was that helicopter running straight into the plane and exploding in the sky. The plane then broke up into 3 pieces and dropped into the freezing waters of the Potomac River. The helicopter, which is hard to see in the video, also dropped out of the sky, hitting the water upside down. People were in shock at what they were seeing. As they rushed to the water's edge, part of the plane immediately sank into the water as you see hundreds of emergency responder vehicles rushing to the scene. They pulled up in their rafts and their diving gear to get in the water as soon as possible to look for survivors, knowing that they only had a short time before any of the survivors would freeze to death in the water. But once the rescuers got to the water, they realized very quickly that this was not going to be a rescue attempt, but rather a recovery operation. Of the 60 passengers and 4 crew members and 3 men on the helicopter, everyone at the scene could see that no one survived. In the end, it was going to be one of the worst air disasters in American history. Remains unclear what the true cause of the crash was. I mean, how could they not see each other? But it's believed that the helicopter was for some reason flying way too high. In any case, officials have retrieved the plane's data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder, known as the black boxes, and will look into the possible contributing factors such as equipment malfunction and what it seems like human error. When you watch the videos of the crash, and there's a few from several angles, you see the planes traveling straight in a line, and then you can see the helicopter. They're both just traveling in a straight line, getting closer and closer, almost like they're playing a game of chicken with each other. Then all of a sudden, sparks shoot out of the plane and the inevitable explosion. You can see the parts of the plane spinning down, and then splashing into the water. Then total darkness. No explosion when the plane impacted on the surface. No lights, just immediate black. The plane and the helicopter sunk in just a second. And it was cold and dark and silent. Then after literally a minute, emergency crews showed up. Then you can see the frantic search to get the people out of the water before, of course, they freeze to death. But as most emergency people who are familiar with these types of crashes, the chance of anyone surviving is extremely rare. And in this case, it was dark and the water was so cold, even pieces of ice were floating in it. When the emergency worker there was no hope of finding survivors, and they had to figure out how to get the bodies out of the water. This is when things get challenging and very dangerous. Most of the passengers are inside the wreckage at the bottom of the river. And then, of course, some are thrown far from the crash. Now, this happened on Wednesday. So even though they've been searching for the past few days, there are still 14 passengers and 2 helicopter pilots that have not been recovered. Some have been discovered. However, they are still not able to get to them. They will be bringing in heavy equipment to try and pull the pieces of the airplane up to the surface so they can cut open the fuselage. The people in charge of the operation believe that once they get the rest of the plane out of the water, the missing passengers will be found. As far as the helicopter, they brought in the U.S. Coast Guard boat, this giant boat with a crane to pull open the door and get all 3 of the servicemen out of the helicopter. Remember, that story we had several weeks ago, I believe, about the bridge falling into the water. Well, the same crane that they were using for that problem, it's on its way to the crash site right now. They will use it to get the big pieces up. Also, some of the stories coming out of the first responders really shows how difficult this has been, dealing with the fast-moving currents and the fact that the water was covered in jet fuel. Many of the wetsuits of the divers were using, they got torn from the sharp parts of the wreckage. The one good thing from the rescue was that a dinner cruise had come through earlier up and broken up most of the ice on the surface, so they didn't have to break anything in order to get to the bottom. The divers working in the scene supposedly are trying to be very careful with everything they are doing, trying to preserve the evidence of the plane and make sure no one gets hurt during the recovery. One of the other issues in this whole recovery operation is the mental health of the divers. According to the head of the squad that's doing the diving, it's not easy because, well, there's so many children involved. Once the decision and plan has been made to remove someone from the plane, it may take hours to get the body free and bring them out of the plane. This has been hard on some of the divers, which are very well trained. However, they had said Nothing can compare you for something like this. There are already reports or issues coming from the air traffic controller that possibly there was only one controller on duty that night. However, there's supposed to be two always. The Transportation Secretary said there was a consolidation of air traffic controllers an hour before it was supposed to happen during the time of the crash. And so was what is the appropriateness of doing that. So did the air traffic controllers notice the helicopter was flying too high? And honestly, why did a military Nighthawk gunship was flying at 9 p.m. anyway, which is the peak time for planes usually? The secretary also said, we haven't had enough air traffic controllers in America for a very long time. He said, adding that they are stressed out, they are tapped out, they are overworked, and there's no excuse. It's just a reality of what we have in the system, end quote. Then there's an ironic twist to all of this. Another plane crashed in Philadelphia right after. This was a medical transport plane heading to Tijuana, Mexico for a stop in Missouri. It was carrying a small child and her mother, a doctor and a paramedic, and two pilots. About a minute after takeoff, the jet crashed. Everybody on board was killed, as well as a person on the ground. 19 others were injured. The girl traveling had just finished a medical treatment for a life-threatening illness. Early on Friday, staff had thrown her a party to celebrate. The staff who treated her had been impacted very deeply by the news of the tragedy. That's according to the hospital spokesman. The flight crashed about 4 miles from the airport. And when it was in the air for only a minute before it finally crashed. Once it got to 1,500 feet, it turned to the right and then turned to the left and then suddenly turned toward the ground. There was no response from the pilots that anything was ever wrong in that flight. Unlike the DC crash, this one hit the pavement, leaving a giant gouge in the pavement. There are 5 separate fires caused by this plane. Witnesses say the explosion lit up the whole sky, saying the whole sky turned orange. Many said that it was in the town of Philadelphia, just a few hundred feet in either direction. This crash could have been much, much worse. In fact, there was a mall nearby, from what I understand, and the debris spans 6 blocks. Now, on the political side of this, which of course there shouldn't be, but there is, if a president speaks about an airplane crash like this one or the DC one, it's usually about how sorry they are and how their hearts and prayers go out to the families. But Donald Trump had an interesting take on the cause of this crash. At a news conference after the crash, Trump implied that maybe the crash was caused by diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, DEI. Now, this is before any investigation had started. Just had the idea it was maybe because the air traffic controller maybe was black or Hispanic or maybe had a disability. He said, we have to have our smartest people as air traffic controllers. Trump also said Thursday morning, it doesn't matter what they look like, how they speak, who they are. They have to be talented, naturally talented, geniuses. Can't have regular people doing their job. We can't have regular people doing this job. They won't be able to do it. But we'll restore faith in the American travel. End quote. Even a week before, Trump took to criticizing the FAA for hiring people with disabilities. He said they want them in the workforce. They want them to be air traffic controllers. I don't think so. Now, later on Thursday, Trump said that because of the Biden White House, that they were recruiting individuals with severe intellectual disabilities in the FAA under the diversity program, the equity, the inclusion hiring. Now, so far, no one seems to know who the president is talking about. Supposedly, the FAA has never hired anyone with profound intellectual disabilities. He then attacked the Obama administration, saying, well, he lowered the requirements for air traffic controllers in the service of DEI. He said their policy was horrible and their politics were even worse, that a group within the FAA determined that the workforce was too white, and they had concentrated their efforts to get the administration to change that and change it immediately, that this was the Obama administration's fault. When a reporter asked Trump what evidence he had of this, Trump said, oh, it's just common sense. In any case, the U.S. had a pretty harsh week as far as airplane crashes go. I know people are saying that because Trump fired all of the officials of the FAA and 100 FAA security officers just before the two planes crashed, that, well, it looks bad. However, so far, there's no evidence that Trump's firing of all those people caused the accident. However, it doesn't really help that he did. This is Lecain with the World News Jam here on DZRJ Radio and Radio Bandito TV. Speaking of Trump, let's do some Trump news. Trump's been super busy in his second week. First off, he halted funding for the benefit and grant programs. Which ones? Well, kind of all of them. Life-saving health research, clean energy projects, education, food assistance. It would essentially remove trillions of dollars in a day from what people who sometimes need it the most, especially now during the winter months. Many of the grants are designed around poor people and the homeless. Also environmental protection programs, psychological services such as anti-suicide, Medicaid programs. But the ironic thing is that so many people that were affected are Trump supporters. There was so much outrage and chaos that after 48 hours, the Trump people rescinded the order. But Trump also took aim at schools in the country, making an order that schools that teach certain subjects based on race, sex, gender, and politics could possibly lose their government benefits. The order looks for ways to cut the budget from schools that teach things such as the history of slavery or talk about transgender subjects. Certain books and films and historical facts will be deleted from the school's programs or risk losing their funds. Also, any schools that allow social transitioning. Social transitioning is when a transgender person begins using a different name, using different pronouns, dressing differently, stops or starts wearing makeup or jewelry. And by the way, Trump also signed an executive order that states that the U.S. only recognizes two genders now, man and woman. So any programs designed to help any other gender are now off the table. Even the passport agency has been ordered to remove the other box under the gender question. But Trump, as you might imagine, really went after the DEI programs, especially in the military. Again, DEI is diversity, equity, and inclusion. In other words, no more diversity programs in the military. The programs that say you must let in a certain number of women or blacks or Asians or Hispanics. They can stop women, say, from being Navy SEALs or flying in jet combat missions. He's directed the Pentagon to end diversity, equity, and inclusion incentives, saying that the military must be decided on merit and leadership alone. Trump that said that he is committed to the mediocrity and the elimination of race-based and sex-based discrimination within the armed forces of the United States. No individual or group within our armed forces should be preferred or disadvantaged based on sex, race, ethnicity, color, or creed. But the key word here is preferred. If white males are always the ones being preferred because of size, strength, family, financial background, then the military will never look like what America really looks like. For instance, officers' jobs will favor males over all other, but takes things even farther, going after this week schools and higher education, the colleges. There's a possibility of Trump taking away funding for all colleges that have quotas, that having to admit a certain number of races and gender is unfair. The Republicans are saying that white men should have the same chances as everyone else. Over the past, however many decades, they have been admitting and hiring races other than whites based on government quotas for equal opportunity. Because, well, for example, blacks may never have enough money to get the right education to get into a top college. But if they could just get into the good college based on a diversity program, then they would have the same chances as more privileged white people. This is what these programs are all about, trying to even the playing field so everyone gets a chance. Otherwise, schools would continue to look like what they did in the 1930s and 40s, all white men. Trump's goal is to take away these programs, and the best way to get rid of them is to use an executive order. He was doing a lot of those this week. He also wants to shut down any and all foreign aid programs so they can be closer analyzed. Trump signed an order shutting down the U.S. aid to other countries for 90 days. All funds are frozen to all U.S. government aid programs. No new projects, no extensions of projects, no new hires, dead stop. All the top people in the U.S. aid department, they were all sent home on paid leave and were cut from their email accounts. Even the photos on the walls of their agency head officials were removed. So many workers overseas doing feeding programs, medical programs, emergency aid, disaster programs, all shut down in an instant. Questions were being asked about offices that feed starving children. Would they close? Would they ever reopen? Many children across the world rely on those programs. The U.S. plays a huge role in responding to international crisis, providing 40% of the world's humanitarian assistance. This has thrown many places in the world into utter chaos. There are medical clinics that, if they are closed, infectious diseases will quickly spread. And if, say, security guards can no longer show up at refuge camps, the gangs and thugs will quickly take over. There are countries that have contracts with the U.S. This is actually a really big problem. Many have said, even Republicans, that the agency needed to reform. But this is not reforming. This is dismantling everything. Everyone is rushing to see what's going to be on the chopping block. Now, of course, any programs that favor DEI are most likely going to get the chop. And anything in collaboration with the World Health Organization is out. And yes, Trump pulled the U.S. out of the World Health Organization. And what about the security of the U.S. and its people overseas? A lot of these programs in some countries are based solely on the country being the U.S.'s ally. If the U.S. cuts funding to, say, the biggest hospital, or maybe we'll stop giving money to the government to feed its soldiers, this could allow for terrorist factions to gain momentum. Like I said, many of these executive orders have created absolute chaos, and some are having very chilling effects around the world. But speaking of chilling, the Senate confirmation hearings to choose Trump's cabinet, that's having some very chilling moments and some hotter moments, hotter than a blister bug in pepper patch, whatever that means. First up is 𝗪cie𝗿𝗃, the director of the FBI, the National Police Force, basically, kind of like the NBI in the Philippines. Many have already asked how on earth this guy even get to this point in the process. In the past, he was considered anti-police, anti-FBI. He seemed to agree more with the QAnon conspiracies from the internet than reality. But the most scary thing about this guy is his eagerness to go after people who don't support Trump. Now, the FBI director position is supposed to last 10 years. The reason being that so the director stays impartial, nonpartisan. The current director is barely through half his term, and he has just resigned. This is why Cash even has gotten into the nominating process. A guy that wrote a book in which he clearly says that enemies of Trump should be arrested. He has a list of specific people in his book that law enforcement should go after. Many of them are people that sat on the January 6th committee, showing the world the videos of the Trump supporters storming the Capitol and beating police officers. I watched this hearing. It was kind of funny sometimes. All he did was just avoid answering the questions. They would ask, "Did you say this?" And he would completely avoid the answer or just outright say no. Then after he would lie, they would play the video of him saying it. He said he wasn't aware of Trump planning to punish anyone from the FBI, especially for case assignments. So basically, he's not watching TV or reading the newspaper or watching any kind of social media, as Trump team has currently been gutting the FBI. Every main official at the FBI has been offered a choice: resign or be fired. They're getting a list of every FBI person that worked on the January 6th insurrection. This was the largest case in FBI history. Thousands of agents worked on it. Is Trump going to fire all of them? Could be more than half of the FBI. Cash said and acted like he had no idea this was going on. He said he doesn't condone violence against police officers, and yet he has defended and raised money for some of the most violent people that attacked police back on January 6, 2020. Then came 𝗪cie𝗪𝗋, who was up for the Director of Homeland Security. The reason she is so controversial is because she was on a governmental watch list for people possibly spying on the U.S. You can't make this stuff up. In the past, she has backed Russia instead of the U.S. on things such as the Ukrainian war. She went to see al-Assad, the ex-president of Syria, who she has supported, one of the biggest enemies of the U.S. Remember him? He has multi-human rights violations, such as dropping poisonous gas on his own people. He ended up having to flee his country to Russia when his government was overthrown just recently. She was also asked about her views on Edward Snowden, the man that stole thousands of secret documents from the U.S. and published them online. He is currently one of the most wanted fugitives in the world, currently hiding out in Russia. She wouldn't really answer the question if Snowden was a traitor, only that he did break the law, but also expose things about the U.S. that needed to be told, even though they were state secrets. She said at one point, "Democrats have accused me of being Trump's puppet, Putin's puppet, Assad's puppet, Modi's puppet. But what truly unsettles them is I refuse to be their puppet." But her biggest fence to cross is if any of those Republicans believe any of her stories. Like 𝗪cie𝗪𝗋, she has said and done many things in her past that are completely contradictory to the office she is seeking. But none can be any more contradictory than that of the nominee for Health Secretary RFK Jr. Remember that guy? That's the guy who used the chainsaw to cut off the head of a whale and strap it to the roof of his car, to hide a bear carcass in Central Park, New York, who did heroin for over a decade and doesn't believe in vaccinations. He will be Trump's head of Health and Human Services. Things that came up in his hearing. The fact that he said that African AIDS is different than Western AIDS, that the CDC Center of Disease Control is much like a Nazi death camp, that certain pesticides will make your children transgendered, that school shootings are caused by antidepressants. But the big one, vaccinating your children is dangerous. He has throughout his professional life has continuously said that vaccinating is bad for your children. He said he didn't know if the polio vaccine caused more deaths than it averted. This is the guy Trump has chosen to run the health department of the U.S. This is Lecain on the World News Jam on DZRJ and Radio Bandito TV. You know, Trump has also gone ahead with his tariffs idea. Many thought that maybe or hopefully Trump was just bluffing or joking on the tariffs idea of charging Mexico and Canada 25% on goods coming into America. I mean, many dub the idea as lunacy because it's the American taxpayer that will take the brunt of the cost of the tariffs. Also, there will be hit on the U.S. economy, not to mention the Canadian economy. Anyway, Trump is going to give it a try anyway. Now, Canada and Mexico have clapped back at Trump, saying they will impose heavy tariffs on the U.S. in retaliation if he does this. What does that means is that soon everything, all goods coming into the U.S. and coming into Mexico and Canada will be taxed. And this is not 1 or 2%, which is the usual tariff. This is 25%. By the way, he also hit China with a 10% tariff. Why only 10%, not 25%? Well, that's a question many are asking. But not as much as who is going to end up paying for these tariffs. Now, depending on whose side you're standing on, the answer could be very different. When Trump first announced he was going to do these tariffs a month before he became president, many economists screamed he can't do that. He ran on the premise of bringing down prices, but a tariff will surely raise prices. I mean, when the goods enter the country, they are taxed. The company buying those products, a U.S. company, will pay those taxes. They will make up the taxes by raising the price of the product. Now, in the case of Canada, they will be bringing in lumber and oil and natural gas, electricity. These are very essential products to the U.S. The U.S. is the single largest user of gasoline and, of course, the lumber for building of houses and natural gas for heating the homes. Now, Canada is going to tariff things like fruit and alcohol coming into their country from the U.S. The Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, saying everyone be safe out there today by the White House will split us apart instead of bringing us together. He talked about the U.S. as source AI model is matching the performance of the California wildfires at a fraction alongside the U.S. in Afghanistan. But experts are saying, and now they're putting tariffs on us. Anyway, China showed the world reason Trump is giving more for doing this. Actually, they've been showing us that for years. But experts say it's just not going to last in the long term. And other illegal drugs. In essence, the markets have overlooked that companies such as Google and Meta will do these massive OpenAI can countries replicate DeepSeek's efficiencies with scalable models with better security and, of course, privacy. Retaliatory tariffs. She said, yes, China categorically reject the White House's slander that the Mexican government has alliances with criminal organizations, as well as any intention of meddling in our territory. Talking about stories going on around the world right here. The United States government, DZRJ and Radio Bandito TV. Thank you so much for joining us today in our discussions, and we hope that they would fight the sale of drugs on the streets of their major cities on the World News Jam, which they don't do. Everyone be safe out there. Of money that this illegal activity generates that has done so much harm to its population. Then the premier of the Canadian province of British Columbia specifically called on residents to stop buying liquor from the U.S., especially the red states, the pro-Trump states, and said it was removing American alcohol brands from the government store shelves as a response to these tariffs. Now, as far as China goes, the China Ministry of Foreign Affairs said that the country's government firmly deplores and opposes this move and will take necessary countermeasures to defend its legitimate right and interests. The Ministry of Commerce in China said it would file a lawsuit with the World Trade Organization for these wrongful practices of the U.S. and take measures to safeguard its rights and interests in China. World News Jam, talking about stories going on around the world. There's an analysis from the Yale economy experts that said that tariffs will probably cost the average U.S. household around $1,170 in income annually. They said economic growth would slow and inflation would worsen. And once the other countries start their retaliatory tariffs, it's going to get even worse. Of course, the Democrats are jumping all over this, saying that Trump ran on the premise of bringing down prices. However, all he will do is raise them. that people should just check the price of a jar of spaghetti sauce now versus in a few months. Check the price of a car in a few months. See if Trump has lowered your prices or raised them sky high. But the World News Jam, talking about stories going on around the world right here on DZRJ and Radio Bandito TV. Thank you so much for joining us today in our discussions, and we hope that we will see you here again on the World News Jam. Everyone be safe out there. We'll see you next time.
The views and comments of the hosts and guests are not necessarily those of the station.
My funny Valentine.
Coming up, Valentine's special show, Valentine's Special, featuring the legendary romantic balladeer Anthony Costello, who will sing his hits such as
Balat kayo lahat ng dahil sa pag